right, well, I am currently prepping everything up to build my little painter shanty. I'm getting the last little bits of sand work. I've taped off about a 1/4 inch below the sub deck level, all the way around, below all my screw holes, all the way around the shear line of the boat. And then I've roughed anything that was shiny or epoxy. I've roughed that all up with 80 grit down to the tape line all the way around. So there's a couple of spots here I filled with fama wood that were tiny little divots. So I'm going to let that, you can see it's, some spots it's lighter, some spots it's darker. I'm waiting for that dark to turn all light. Doesn't take very long, and then I can sand it up. So just fill in a couple of little tiny low spots. In the back, I've got the rear of the transom, same thing. Got my tape across it. It's about an 1/8 inch below our little cover piece here. And then sand it all up to that tape line, same as the inside of the motor well. It's all taped off, just about a 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch below, and all sanded up, ready to go. So we're just prepping everything, getting the zip ready for its coats of epoxy tomorrow. I've watched the weather like a hawk. Tomorrow's my best shot. It's the lowest humidity that we've had in about 3 weeks, and it doesn't dip below freezing tomorrow evening. So my plan is to get all of this sanded and prepped. I've got 2x4s sitting over here. I'll get those all stood up and clamped to my rafters. I went and bought the bisqueen, so I'll build all the walls today and the ceiling of my painter shanty. Get everything sanded, prepped, wiped down, and the painter shanty up and ready. So tomorrow morning I'll come out at about, I don't know, 6 a.m. or so. I'll get my little heaters, there's one down here. I'll get those set up inside the shanty, get them running, let them run for 3 or 4 hours, and I have a thermometer that I'll put inside the shanty to monitor temperature, and when I see it get to about 65 or so, then I'll start rolling on coats. My plan is to get 2 coats on this tomorrow. I'll roll on a coat, then I will let that green up, which epoxy terms, green means that it's not sticky, but you can still dent it with your fingernail. It's not 100% cured. So as soon as I reach that green, I guess we'll call it green cure of the epoxy, then I can safely roll on my second coat. That's going to provide me a nice, strong chemical bond. I won't be relying on a mechanical bond, whereas if you let the epoxy completely cure, then you have to sand it to get a mechanical bond. So as long as I get the epoxy, the second coat on while it's still green, it'll be a chemical bond, nice and strong, and a pretty thick layer. I plan on doing real thin coats, 2 thin coats. When that's done, then I'll sand the entire top of the thing. I'll roll on a 3rd coat, and then I think we can start striping this thing. Who knows how far we're going to get in December, but we're going to get some epoxy on it at least. Making good progress. Well, we now have our little painter shanty up. This one actually turned out a lot better than the last one. But everything's sealed. All of the seams are reinforced with strips, thin little strips of wood. And then I went ahead and sealed all of the seams just with some clear packaging tape. And I think this should do to keep the temperature up while I'm getting a couple coats on it. You can see we've got our thermometer over there so I can monitor it. So we're set up. We're pretty well ready. First thing in the morning, we'll get some heat in here and get started. Well, here's where we currently are. We've gone up about 10 degrees in the last hour out here with 2 heaters running. So won't be too much longer, maybe another hour or so, and we can start putting epoxy on this thing. But here we are. This morning, while it was warming up in here, I went ahead and wiped the entire surface down everywhere, all the edges, inside and out, with rubbing alcohol on a clean rag, rolling the rag. You know, I'd wipe a little bit, roll the rag, wipe a little bit, just removing loose dust from the planks, and there was a lot of it. So I got all that done. It's completely dry again. You can see the walls of this thing as the air in here expands. You know, it's starting to push out on everything. as obviously as the gas gets warmer, it expands. But even the ceiling, which used to droop down, it's all pushed up tight now up against all the rafters. But we're making good progress, just waiting for the temp. We now have 2 heaters in here. There's one down at the corner of the boat over there, running on high, and then I've got this little guy down here, also running on high. So probably another hour we can start coating this thing. Well, we got the very first coat of epoxy on everything, and that darkened it up a ton. As you can see in the reflection, it's still real rough. This is the very first coat again, but very, very happy with how it's turning out. This is coat number 1. We'll take a look at the thermometer we just finished. So there we are. And it's getting warmer and warmer and warmer in here. But just as a side note, I did round over this interior cockpit edge prior to epoxy on both cockpits, both sides. But there we are. First coat of epoxy is on. Really, of course, you know, like always, brought out the color and the grain in the wood. Got all my tape peeled off. We're going to let this cure now. We'll come back and do a second coat. Well, as you can see, I was able to get it up to 85 degrees in my painter shanty today. That's pretty respectable considering it is 57 outside, 57 degrees ambient temperature. You can see the surface, just like everything with the first coat of epoxy. It's really, really bumpy. I was really hoping to get 2 coats on this thing today. It's just not in the cards. We have reached the high temperature for the day that it's going to get outside. It's only going to get colder from this point. And on top of that, over the course of the next hour, humidity goes up 8%, and it continues to go up for the remainder of the evening. So there's a likely chance if I were to put a coat of epoxy, a second coat on this today, I could still maintain the temperature fairly warm in here, but the humidity would kill it and it would probably cloud. And because this is obviously the most visible part of the entire boat, I don't want that to happen. So we're just going to live with 1 coat to start with. I'll let the heaters run in here and keep it as warm as I can for as long as I can to get this to hopefully fully cure today. And then we'll just sand it like anything else and do a second coat. So there's where we are. It's lumpy and bumpy, but man, it looks pretty. The grain is so pretty. And when it's sanded and another coat, it'll get smoother yet, and sanded and another coat, smoother yet. And anyhow, making good progress. Well, we have now attacked the first coat of epoxy with 80 grit. You can see that the shine is completely gone. See the white back here, this is all dust. It's all sanding dust. But first coat is sanded up. Tomorrow we'll come out, we'll wipe it all down with alcohol, tape off my edges. I still have to sand the interior cockpit edges, so I'll get all that sanded, and we'll get the booth heated and put the second coat on. So we now have the second coat of epoxy on the top of the deck. Turned out, again, it's still bumpy, but it's much, much smoother than the first coat. And the reason I wanted to do this is build up a couple of coats. Hopefully that epoxy would just slightly run over the edges. So when I fill this with my white filler, the epoxy wouldn't soak into that grain and then end up with tiny little spiders of white epoxy into the edges of the grain and make the edges of my white seams look fuzzy, basically. So that's why I did a couple coats of epoxy prior to seam filling it. It may not have happened, but I didn't want to take that risk, because if that happened, there's probably nothing I could do to fix it. So I put 2 coats on. Second coat's done, it's cured. It's still bumpy, but it's a lot smoother than the first coat. And I have masked off my seams in the rear here, and I'm getting ready to mix up some micro balloons, basically the fairing compound, that bright white fairing compound. Same stuff I used on the bottom of the boat to fill my seams and also to smooth in the skeg to put a fillet on each side of the skeg, that's what I use, micro balloons. I'm going to mix the same stuff up, micro balloons again, because it's bright, bright white, and that's the color I want. I know that it works well with my epoxy, and it'll be a nice, strong, permanent seam. So, got it all taped off back here. I'm getting ready to mix some up and put it in the seams and peel my tape. We'll see how it works. This is an experiment here. It might not work at all, but I think it'll work. I'm not the first guy that's done this, so I've done a little research. All right, well, we've got our mixture of micro balloons and epoxy put in the cracks. So I used a cake decorating tip with one of the cake bags and just basically put it in there like it was frosting. I mixed it up to about the same consistency as frosting. Just kept adding micro balloons until I got the right consistency and a nice bright white color. So here it is. I just basically piped it right into the seams and then took a little squeegee and squeegeed it off flush, a little plastic squeegee. And as soon as it starts to firm up a bit, I'll get my tape peeled on each side and we'll take another look at it. That's where we are. So here's a look at it with the tape peeled off. Of course, the stripes are still real soft. I wanted to get the tape off before the epoxy cured, but pretty darn happy with it. And of course, when I sand all of this flush, any places where the epoxy may have just slightly got out of that groove will be sanded down, take that top layer off, recoat it, and they'll be perfect lines. But I'm very, very happy with the look of it so far. Making good progress. I think this idea just might work. Alright, so I now have a decent portion of the bridge deck, as you can see, with the seam filler in it. I tried a slightly different method on the bridge deck. As you can see, you know, the lines aren't near as straight and they're kind of poofy looking. If we look down at them, you can see how they're sticking up above the deck. They're all proud of the deck, some more than others, but at a minimum, they're all sticking up above the deck by about 1/16 of an inch. What I did different on this one is, again, I laid my tape out across all of them, and they're still soft. Once they cure, I'll peel my face tape off of it here, but before it cured, I wanted to get the top tape off of it. But basically, I laid my tape out on there. I same thing, used my piping bag to fill them. All proud of the deck a little bit, but I didn't, on the bridge deck, I did not take that plastic squeegee and squeegee them off flush. And there's a reason I didn't do that. You probably can't tell on the rear, maybe you can, but all of these have a very slight concave, all of them. They are below the deck height, just slightly, a few thousandths, but it's enough that I'm going to have to tape these back off. And again, this is unsanded. I haven't sanded any of this. You can see how some of it's outside a little bit. Some of it's up here on top of this little tip. But anyhow, I'm going to have to retape these all off, wipe them down with alcohol, lightly sand the white, wipe it down with alcohol again, and then come back and apply more of this mixture over the top to get them above the deck. So they, you know, right now they don't look bad. Sanded up, they would be much straighter than they already are, but they're going to be below the deck, and I want it to be flush. So I'm going to have to do a second application over the top of most of these. Not all of them, but most of them, to get them proud of the deck so I can sand it down flush. So I think this is actually, squeegeeing them off is going to produce more work in the end than leaving them all bumped up proud of the deck and then sanding them down flush. Again, this is an experiment. I could be wrong. I'll let you guys know in next month's video, ultimately, how it turned out, you know, what I think's a better method. But I'll let these cure up for a day or two, and then I'll go ahead and attack this half of the bridge deck with 80 grit on a random orbital and see how, number one, they should sand really easy because it's fairing compound, but just see how difficult it is to sand them. And how they look as compared to the rear, and whether or not I think it's going to be more work to do it like this, to squeegee them off, or to leave them proud of the deck and sand them down flush. I have a feeling this is going to be less work and produce a better seam in one try than this method. But again, I'll let you know how it turns out. So that's where we are at the moment. Just letting this stuff cure up, and then we'll start attacking it with some sandpaper. Well, it's officially January 1st, 2018. For the month of December 2017, we went up 21 hours. So good hours for December, considering historically what my December hours have been. It's not too bad. We went up $56.90 this month. Of that 21 hours, 5 1/4 of that was fairing. So that brings our fairing up to 53 1/4 hours. And the remainder of the month went into epoxy, 15 3/4 hours into epoxy, and that brings our epoxy up to 94 1/2 hours. So I'm counting the seam filling as epoxy work. I guess I could count it as deck work, but I mean, if we're being honest, it is basically just epoxy with micro balloons mixed into it. So I'm counting all the deck seam work as epoxy work or epoxy coat work. So, you know, for this month, January, we're going to see this epoxy coat continue to climb. So that brings us up to, let's see, our $56.90. That brings us up to $9,427.87 invested. And our 21 hours even brings us up to 894 1/2 hours total into the zip. So we're getting close to that 900 hour mark. We'll take a look at where we're at. So we are in the exact same place as we were in the previous little bit of video. Basically, I've got 16 of the bridge deck seams filled. Again, they're cured now. This is sat for about a day and a half, so they're completely cured. I went ahead and peeled off my face tape on the front side of the cockpit seat back and on the dash of the rear cockpit. The blue masking tape or painter's tape that I had on the face to keep this stuff from running out the ends. So after this stuff cures, I peel that off. It comes right off. The epoxy doesn't adhere to it, which is nice. And it leaves me with, you know, with good looking ends of each one. Now if we look close, you can see how this seam is nice and square, and then it's kind of like flattened and squished out on the top. So theoretically, when I sand this down flush, it should be this perfect width seam all the way down. Again, once I get into sanding this down, I'll then make a decision whether it's easier to fill it proud of the deck, sand flush, or fill it proud of the deck, squeegee it flush, and second fill it. I'll let you guys know in the next video which way worked out better, because I want to determine that before I come up into the bow and start filling the bow. So there's a few things I wanted to talk about that I think are important and I didn't want to skip. One of them is the seams. I talked about seam sanding. I did seam sand this interior edge of my cover boards all the way around because I wanted that to be uniform, and because, you know, I cut these on my bandsaw, they were fairly close, but some of them were a little tight here and there. So what I did was I took my same spacer that I used to set the width of all of these planks, and I just started taking it and placing it in this seam, and I would just slide it down the seam until I found a spot that was sticky. So at that point, you know, then I would take it, I would set it beside it, and I built, this is my seam sanding board. It's just a piece of 1/8 inch plywood. It's very, very flexible, but it's also semi-rigid, so it worked out pretty well. And I glued that same 80 grit emery cloth to it, or sandpaper. So once I found a spot that was, you know, a little bit stiff, I would take this board, flex it to fit that gap with 2 hands, and then I would just sand back and forth until this spacer would slide freely all the way down this seam. So I just kept working with my little, I guess we'll call it seam sanding board, or skinny long board on edge. I just kept working my way down the ends of these planks all the way around the boat. It took me 45 minutes to do that total. Both sides, 45 minutes total to completely seam sand that inboard edge. So I made sure I did that before I put the first coats of epoxy on the deck. So that's how I did it. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the, I guess we'll call it the pastry bag. This is it, Wilton brand, found it at Walmart. It came with 2 bags and the little tip. The tip is about 1/4 inch. And this has been fantastic for filling these seams. I mean, it's just the way to go. Yeah, it was cheap, easy to use. The 1/4 inch round just fits right on the top. You know, each side of that nozzle just barely touched the edge of my seam, and I can watch it completely fill the gap as I'm moving along. So this is one of the bags with the hardened micro balloons and epoxy. You can see the white color. I just cut my tip out of it before it cured and got it cleaned out so I could reuse it. But this is it. It's just a pastry bag. You can see how I've twisted the end, and you just squeeze it in there like it's frosting. And what I'm using for, and I'm sure you've heard me talk about it, micro balloons. So I'm mixing the epoxy, about 50% epoxy to about 50% micro balloons. And this is it right here. They call them glass bubbles, but it is by the Fiberlay company. And it's basically, once you mix this in there, it makes the epoxy much less dense. Super easy to sand. Epoxy is difficult to sand as it is, but you add this stuff to it, at least 50%, it becomes very easy to sand. And it's got a really nice bright white color, which I love. It looks really good on it. So 2 bonuses for the seams here. But this is it, glass bubbles by Fiberlay. This stuff is like, there's still some in here, but it is talcum powder fine. Whenever you work with this stuff, wear a respirator. This stuff hangs in the air like fog. It is very fine. So that's what I'm using to fill the seams with, the material at least. I'm still using my Glen-L epoxy shield, the same stuff that I'm coating the deck in. This is the application manner that I'm using, and this is how I sanded my seams. So I wanted to go over all of that. My goal for January is to get the rest of the seams filled, sanded flush, any secondary filling if there is. And I would really like to have an encapsulating coat over the entire deck and seams by the end of January. That's my goal. We'll see what happens. So I have a request. I don't know who it is, but I think it's hilarious. For about the last year and a half, it's got to be the same guy, but one particular person that will wait for me to upload a video just to give me a thumbs down. If you go back through like the last 15 videos, most of them will have 1 thumbs down. And it just frickin' cracks me up. I laugh so hard every time I see that. So I have a request. Any of you, all of you that made it to the end of this video, that made it through my babbling, do me a favor and give me a thumbs down on this video. I think that's gonna be frickin' hilarious. But thank you for watching. Please rate and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Make sure you give me a thumbs down, and we'll catch you guys on the next update of building the zip.